All right, glad to have you back. President Bola Tinubu has commended the African Export-Import Bank for its vital role in driving economic development and integration across the African continent. He particularly commended the bank's audacious leadership and its generational impact on Africa's economic culture and future. Speaking at the 32nd Afreximbank annual meetings in Abuja, President Tinubu applauded the bank's achievements and Nigeria's commitment to strategic partnership. He said the bank has championed Africa's pandemic response, industrialization, free trade, and creative economy over the past decade. He said Nigeria, as Africa's most populous nation, had greatly benefited from the bank's wide-ranging support. In his words, Nigeria has proudly received over $52 billion in support for energy, agriculture, infrastructure, healthcare, manufacturing, and creative sector. Said flagship projects include the Dangote Refineries, African Medical Center of Excellence, and Africa's Quality Assurance Center. My guest is Dr. Biodun Adedikpe. He is the Chief Consultant, B. Adedikpe Associate Limited. Dr. Adedikpe, I must thank you so much for your time on the program and your patience. Let's start with our relationship with Afribank. I know you follow all of this. And now, President said about $52 billion have been committed, various sectors of Nigeria's economy. What do you think about the relationship with Nigeria and, of course, across the continent of Afribank? Have they done really well?
Well, my straight answer to that, Tulu, thank you for having me, is a straight yes. Afribank has done well, not just for Nigeria, but for the entire continent. When one looks at important dimensions to inclusive growth, and I chose that deliberately, which means the focus is not just growth, but inclusive one. Now, the first key thing for me is that Afribank has been a driver, if you like, use the word kicker of investment. So in which case, it's like giving a backbone to African economies to be able to attract and also retain investment that are very, very important, not just for growth, but for development of the economies. Then secondly, from my own perspective here, my lens, is the sector-specific interventions that Afribank has made over the years, especially in the last one decade, which indeed has helped to deepen and also give life to specific sectors of the economy, like you mentioned in your opening remarks now. If you look at Nigeria as a reference, and you look at these sectors where Afribank has intervened, there are sectors where the economy has been challenged, and so intervening there has helped in shifting the narrative as far as those sectors are concerned. And perhaps more importantly, the fact of integration of the African economy, bringing what I would call a fillip to intra-African trade, especially for me, is what the bank launched some 2-3 years ago, the payments platform that enables us to avoid the challenges, the cost, the pressures with trading through third currencies. In which case, I'm based in Nigeria, I can trade with somebody in Ghana on Afribank platform without needing first to go and buy US dollar, then convert to Ghanaian cedi. So it's a fantastic payment platform that I believe also has done very well in strengthening intra-African trade. And the list continues. Okay, if you look at every African country, the intervention in the various sectors is also country-specific, not what they call, a common size that fits all that we normally get from other, multilateral institutions, especially those that are from outside of Africa. But this one is truly African, understand the problems, and this with them specifically in order to drive not only growth, but growth that is inclusive in nature by creating jobs in Africa.
I'm looking at the report that they are planning to create about 250,000 or employ 250,000 persons with a proposed $5 billion textile facility in Nigeria. That is also highly commendable. But do you think for Nigeria, really, are we set to take advantage of this?
I will say that we are set. And why will I say that? Now, if we look back historically, that sector of the Nigerian economy used to be the largest employer of labor outside of government. That's textiles. Now, one way or the other, we mismanaged the sector. Most of the entities there either failed or became converted into other businesses. I recall very vividly one of the leading players in that sector sometime in 1996 That was the year I exited FCMB, okay? In fact, it was the last transaction I handled before I left FCMB in 1996. And that was for that entity to access the stock market, and raise fresh capital. So I was in charge of the transaction. And so when I engaged the CFO of that particular entity, I observed in looking at their financials that what they were making from textile business, which was the flagship for the company, so to say, was in fact only 30% of their gross income. So I told the CFO, I said, listen, what I see here, and please, we need to engage with your MD. You are no longer a textile company. You are, in fact, from your numbers here, a conglomerate. So if I'm going to present to the stock market, I'll present your stock as not a textile entity, but a conglomerate that has a strong foothold in textile. But today, all of those we've lost. So now what I see, therefore, in this initiative by Afribank is to recreate what Nigeria had lost. And of course, the BOI has also done a lot of work in trying to bring life into that sector. So for me, therefore, it's like what Afribank is bringing will complement what the Bank of Industry Nigeria has also been doing in trying to revive that sector. It's a good development for us. And it's not just about how much is put in there, as rightly said. The number of jobs that can be created, 250,000 is not few. So for me, it's bringing back the glory of textile in Nigeria with all the various benefits across the entire ecosystem.
Now, talking about improving trade across the continent, which I agree that the bank has been instrumental in doing that, I want to ask you, what more can be done, particularly with the AFCFTA? I had a discussion sometime last week, and I don't want this to just be a conversation, as always. Agua came and left. I told my guest that day. And now AFCFTA is here. So what more, what sort of conversation should we now be having moving forward to make sure that this works perfectly for us as a country?
Thank you very much for that question. Now, each time we look at AFCFTA, what we see is a huge market estimated at about $3.4 trillion. But the question is, if this will happen, then African countries must build trust and confidence in one another. So in which case, they must develop that trust that if I import something from Nigeria, it not only will meet the quality specifications, but be at such level that can outcompete what comes from extra Africa, that is from outside Africa. Now, that trust needs to be built so that we begin to do more business with one another. And I see a window there of what we need to really address. The moment we can build that trust and confidence across the borders within Africa, we'll be on our way to deepening intra-regional trade, and of course, with all the benefits of that in terms of manufacturing, in terms of jobs, in terms of international competitiveness, and of course, so many other benefits we can derive from that. That, for me, is the major challenge. Even within trade blocks, we take West Africa, East Africa, Southern Africa, North Africa, is the same challenge. So the real integration that this process can drive will come from doing things deliberately to build trust and confidence.
Now, what sort of regulation now do you expect from member countries to support all of this?
Thank you so very much. I think the critical thing for me is, we call this, under this context, we talk about a borderless Africa. That is within. Borderless Africa, intra. So what this means then is that every African nation should interrogate their rules and regulations for intra-African trade and identify where there are, restrictions, where there are challenges, so that we can work together to address them. Now, I've seen this play out, and I'll give an example, and that is using ECOWAS to illustrate. Now, some 30 years ago, that was 1995, I was interviewed on ECOWAS when it was 20 years old. What do I think about the ECO, that's the common currency, what the prospect? And I remember making it very clear that until we look at regulatory restrictions and also build that confidence and trust across our borders, we are not likely to see that common currency become a thing that is reality. And why is it so? Because oftentimes when we set the terms and conditions of engagement and agreement with one another in Africa, we often work with rules set for us by non-Africans. And that is the major challenge I see here. The rules that we relate on and in fact come to agreement with one another should be defined by Africans who understand the issue, the culture, even the nuances, so that we are able to set rules that enable us to engage with one another. Not rules set for us by people who are outside of Africa, who know next to nothing about our culture and the mindset of the regular African. That is the major constraint I've seen there. Unfortunately, like the case of ECOWAS I mentioned, what I saw then 30 years ago are still bedeviling us today. And I think we can take a lesson from that in dealing at the continental level. So the rules and regulations, we interrogate them first maybe on bilateral basis, and then we bring it to multilateral, but as much as possible, whatever the requirements and conditions are, let them be what we set ourselves, not rules and requirements that are set by quote and unquote foreigners to Africa.
I'm interested in how we could better integrate and, of course, promote African trade. But looking ahead, before we wrap this up, what's your outlook for strengthening Africa's trade relations? I always try to refer. I'm sure there's been another intra-African trade fair after the one that happened in South Africa. I think the other one happened in Egypt or somewhere. But if we continue, what's your outlook really for deepening these trade ties and taking advantage of this large market?
Well, my outlook for it is positive, and I will tell you why. If you look at where we were in 2021, 1st of January, when AFTA kicked into operation, and where we were January 2025, bringing Nigeria now into the picture, and where Nigeria is as of today, the last day of the first half year, we have moved in terms of specific transactions that are intra-Africa within the context of the agreement. So that means we're already making progress. So what we now need is to deepen this by making the opportunities, information opportunities available to people generally. The more people are aware of this, the more they want to explore those opportunities within the African continent. So if we do more of this, we see more entities come within that frame. And of course, even individuals who are into business, like, MSMEs, can come into that space as well. The more of them are coming there, the larger the volume of trade we'll be doing with one another in Africa. And that is why, for me, I see the outlook as positive. Of course, these events are also important, where we share information and tell stories. Stories are very powerful. Let us begin to tell stories about the success cases within Africa, where we do business with one another. Those stories will provoke and also encourage others to also exploit it. So I see a very positive outlook, in the medium to long term with respect to this agreement and the continental market that we have in Africa.
Interesting conversation, as always. And I think we'll have another version on our next chat to get your views on the Tax Act. I know you have your views in regards to that. So we would have that conversation, yeah. Dr. Adedikpe. I must thank you so much for joining us this Monday afternoon. That's why your busy schedules. Chief Consultant B. Adedikpe Associates Limited has been my guest. Thank you so very much for making sense of the second segment of the show today.
Thank you for having me, Tolu. Enjoy the rest of your day.